This is our first meeting this year. It's not special. Only a test for the trustees and for the sponsors of our Foreign Affairs Council. And I'd like to find it rather difficult to talk here. I'm distracted by the view out there. It's a more impressive one. This is the first time that we've been in our office upstairs. And we owe Rich Anderson, where's Rich? Not here? Rich Anderson, thanks for working with us to acquire our offices up on the floor above. Here he comes, the director of the World Trade Center. We're fortunate to be able to acquire the kind of offices we have. A premier location. As a matter of fact, we haven't signed the agreement yet, the contract, and I'm supposed to do that this evening, but they're going to give it to me to sign. First time I've seen the office. The first time Frank has seen it. This discussion this evening is kind of special. We're talking about it. And I am not going to introduce our speaker. His name there is before you. But to have this privilege, to allow this privilege to Dr. Frank Bird. And again, I don't think he needs any introduction, but Frank is the reason we're here. Frank is the one who's worked hard the past couple of years in developing our council. And it's through his efforts that we're here down at the World Trade Center, not trying to power a little corner up there in the convention center or something at the Hilton Hotel. And with that, Frank, I'd like to turn the meeting over to you.
Well, we're really fortunate this evening to have Mr. Anthony Lake with us. As you all know, Mr. Lake was most recently director of the Policy and Planning Staff at the Department of State, a most important position held formerly by George Kennedy, of course, and one of those, and a unique place where the State Department thought that perhaps they could escape from the pressures of everyday politics. But Mr. Lake is now going to make the ultimate escape from the pressures of everyday politics and accept a professorial position at Amherst University. Mr. Lake is a graduate of Harvard, a BA in history, MA and PhD degrees from the policy studies at Woodrow Wilson School in Princeton. He studied international economics at Cambridge. 1962 until 1970, he became a service officer. He received the State Department Superior Honor Award in 1967. He was a member of Henry Kissinger's National Security Council staff in 69 and 70. In 71 and 72, he was campaign coordinator for Mr. Simon Lunsford. In 1974 to 1976, he was executive director of an organization responsible for sponsoring volunteers for self-help projects throughout the globe. He served as a member of the transition team to Mr. Carter in 1976, and more specifically headed up the State Department transition team that same year before assuming the position he now holds. He's written numerous articles. He published a book, The Tar Baby Option, concerning American foreign policy toward what was Southern Rhodesia. Also, he was a contributing editor to The Vietnam Legacy, a set of original papers published in American foreign policy after Vietnam. In a sense, perhaps the position which he held most recently was council, perhaps, God willing, is the first third of a career of public service. I think we can look forward over the next couple of decades to observing the contributions that Mr. Lake will make both as a scholar and as a public servant. This afternoon, he's agreed to speak for a few minutes directly to the topic with which he's most familiar, the Carter Foreign Policy Reconsidered. Mr. Lake is recognized as one of the major architects of the Carter Foreign Policy, and we are especially glad that he'll address that particular subject. This afternoon we'll, as has been remarked, we'll have an off-the-record discussion. comments which are made are not attributable. Members of the press who are here may consult with Mr. later, of course, and be pleased to discuss whether his remarks can be published. The particular topic is one of interest to all of us. It's with a great deal of pleasure that I welcome our distinguished guest, Mr. Weber.
I hope I won't be too distracted as I speak. I review it's much more attractive than I do a lot of the original scenes in the company. I asked it to be off the record mostly so that I could be as honest and frank as possible. The subject of great interest to me, obviously. I'm looking forward to hearing your views on it also. I know when I hear somebody say that they're going to be honest and frank, I immediately reach for my wallet to make sure that's not already been taken out of my pocket, because there's no such thing as objectivity. Oscar Wilde once said about sincerity, I don't have this exactly right, but a little sincerity is really dangerous, and a great deal of sincerity is usually fatal. But I will try, and for that reason I wanted it off the record, because I don't think it's seemly for people now who would certainly be attacking the Reagan administration. Honeymoon is a wonderful American institution, I think should be preserved. I also think it's unseemly for people who have been working for presidents, as I have been for President Carter, to say critical things publicly about them. But I think we're genuinely successful some failures and some things that are critical. One, this is, I think, the thing that I enjoyed most, certainly working on the last 4 years, was working rather hard on getting the Baltimore Orioles to Nicaragua last spring. Visit in a period when they were desperately looking for ambassadors of goodwill, I think was especially. I think it would backfire a little bit. A few months after this, we were desperately looking for aid for Nicaragua as a means of violent influence down there. Obviously, the people who were opposed to it, I guess, resented how popular the Orioles had become in Nicaragua and how many fans there were in Nicaragua, because every time we asked for aid, the pardon me, people kept saying that Nicaragua is for the birds. So if I survived that, then Now what I do is first just sketch very briefly how the world looked and looks to the Carter administration, still looks to the and the kinds of elements as a result, the kinds of elements that I think have to go into a foreign policy if it's going to be successful, serve our national interests, and then based on that, review some of the successes and failures of the Carter administration, and then say a little bit about because it's a discussion that I'm looking forward to mostly. So this will be very much in shorthand, and then we can get into the specifics, some of which we've already started getting into upstairs. I think there are 4 major trends in the world that have to be addressed. Many of them are unpleasant, but they have to be addressed. The first, obviously, is the Soviet challenge. The Soviet defense budget, the military budget that goes beyond any legitimate defense needs for the Soviet Union. And the Soviet assertiveness, a global assertiveness that they equate with their role as a superpower. We've seen the consequences of that in Angola, Ethiopia, Afghanistan, Cambodia, other places. This is a challenge that simply has to be addressed as the bedrock of any American foreign policy. But as I'll emphasize later, it is not the only challenge to be addressed. The second trend that has received less attention, but that is a very important one, are changes in the international political system. This is not only the obvious point that there are some 50 new nations that are now members of the UN that have to be dealt with in our diplomacy just in the last couple of decades. And there are about almost 100 new members of the UN since its founding in 1945. But it's also the evolution of new power centers in the world, the OPEC nations, the increase in military capabilities of a lot of third world countries, and the fact that with our allies now in the European common market, for example, they have a greater population and actually a greater GNP, gross national product, than the United States does itself. This means, this diffusion of power in the world means not that the United States is growing weaker, although it can seem that way to us. In fact, our power, or at least our strength, is greater than it's been in our history. But with the growth of power of other nations, our relative strength, our relative power in the world is diminished. That's an unpleasant fact, but it's true, and it requires of us new ways of thinking about how we still lead in the world, because the United States must lead. A third trend or change in the world is changes in the international economic system. Since it crept up on us a little hasty, we may not be aware of the magnitude, for example, of the change in oil prices just in the last couple of years. In fact, they have tripled in the last 2 years, which is an extraordinary, which had extraordinary implications not only for global inflation and the impact on the industrial economies, but in the debt problems for very important developing countries. And of course, it's related to the change in the political system. The fourth change is not a change among nations, but a change within nations. Largely as a result of the revolution in communication, particularly transistor radio, which is a big name coming out in the years here, which I think is terribly significant. It means that not only the people who can afford to, in other countries who can afford to enjoy the wonders of multi-billion-dollar technology and television, etc., but for a couple of dollars, they can listen on a transistor radio to what is happening in the world and get an electronic picture of a world that not only seems to be, but in fact is, for many of them, a much better world than that they have. This has led to a tremendous explosion of expectations, of demands for a better life for these people, for greater participation in the political and economic decisions of their countries. Seen this in Spain, seen it in Zimbabwe, seen it in El Salvador, seen it in Iran, seen it around the world. This is the reality that we dealt with also leads to great instabilities and challenges that affect our interests. So all four of these trends, these changes in the world, the growth in Soviet power, changes in the international political systems, changes in the international economic system, rapid change within nations, act together, if you think about it, in almost any region. Almost any problem we encounter, all four of them are intertwined. And a successful American foreign policy, in my view, has to deal with all four. I do not believe that a policy which sees only one of these factors, the Soviet factor, at work, will be a successful policy, because it will be dealing with only one part of the problem and not all of the problem together. So the Carter administration decided that it would broaden the agenda of foreign policy concerns. It would deal with all four of these general trends at once. This meant a foreign policy that had a number of elements in it. I think there are 8 or 9 of them, and I would announce to you that I will list 8 or 9 of them, but then I always, when I do that, end up at 7. Go home wondering what the 8th went, but let me think of it. The first element of a successful policy, and what the Carter administration is trying to do, is to make sure that military balances are maintained, that the global military balance is maintained, and that regional balances are maintained in areas of vital American interest, including most notably now the Persian Gulf area. And I won't review in each of these what was actually done, but just lay out the general goals. Second element of this was to, while maintaining this balance, to try to work for a more stable relationship with the Soviet Union, at the same time as making sure that we were strong enough to compete effectively to try to advance towards a relationship that is more consistent with some certainty about world peace. This requires, in a period of increasing Soviet assertiveness, a policy that was encapsulated in the thought that détente rests on deterrence. The thought being that when the Soviets do change the rules of the game, as they did in Afghanistan, as they previously had done in Angola, there has to be a penalty for it. Because if there is not, then Soviet behavior will not be moderated in the long run. And unless Soviet behavior is moderated in the long run, then you cannot build, obviously, a more stable relationship. A third element, third element, I think, was an element of arms control. Arms control, originally seen by candidate Carter as a step towards disarmament, a goal which is, in my view, totally unrealistic, but which increasingly the administration portrayed as an effort to gain Soviet restraint with policies, just as you, in your sanctions over Afghanistan, are trying to achieve more restraint Soviet behavior. So it's in American interest to try to gain restraint in their military spending through balanced arms control agreements, and at the same time to achieve greater American security at lower levels of expenditure, a point of increasing importance as we run into more and more economic difficulties at home. Fourth element in this very complex fabric of policies had to be increasing strength of our allies and increasing cooperation with them. In a period in which America's relative power, again, not her absolute power, but her relative power is reduced, it becomes all the more important that we act in conjunction with our allies, use their additional strength, their additional resources, their additional wisdom in joint strategies. This worked very effectively, I think, particularly in Africa, the Chaba invasions, and in the diplomacy over Zimbabwe, and although it has not yet succeeded in Namibia. This is becoming increasingly complicated, however, to carry out. The fact is that while we need the allies more than ever before, it's becoming increasingly difficult to coordinate our policies with them, because our interests in many areas simply are not, while they may be generally parallel, they are not synonymous. For example, in the Persian Gulf area, they are more dependent on oil and on good relations with the oil-producing countries than we are, which explains some of the differences over the approach to Arab-Israeli peace. And in Europe itself, they have a stronger stake in détente in Europe than we do. The Germans, in particular, because of their the importance to them of a relatively open border. This has led to a basic political difficulty in which, in Europe, détente is woven very deeply into the fabric of their politics, and it is good politics in Europe to be for détente, while at the same time in the United States it has been bad politics to be for détente, it has been good politics to be for a greater confrontation. Yet the fact remains that if we are to work together with our allies, we're simply going to have to make compromises on a joint strategy before those strategies are launched if they're going to go along with us. Here I would not give the Carter administration all the allies are falling behind, given the power relationships and not such that will automatically occur. The fifth element of such a policy is somewhat related to that fourth one conceptually, and that is the importance of an inclusive rather than an exclusive diplomacy, especially in the third world. Just as we cannot do a lot of the things we want to do in the world alone and without the allies, so we could not succeed in our diplomacy in a lot of areas without the cooperation of local states. This again is obvious in Zimbabwe, when we could not have helped achieve a settlement in Zimbabwe without the active assistance of the frontline states that owned Nigerians. It simply, in my view, makes no sense to have a diplomacy which is exclusive, which refuses to deal with third world nations because we may differ on the path to economic development or because we disagree on some political issues, and then to refuse to deal with them on economic issues in which we both have an interest. I'll come back to that point, but the Carter administration did try to pursue thus an inclusive diplomacy that would expand our influence in the third world, which led to such things as normalizing relations with China, to greatly improved relations with a lot of African nations, notably Nigeria, improved relations with ASEAN countries in Southeast Asia, etc. Linked to that, in turn, I think there is a sixth element of any successful diplomacy, which is a very aggressive peacemaking effort in troubled areas. This led to constant efforts in the Middle East and Southern Africa, and Central America, and elsewhere. This was not done simply out of an idealistic devotion to peace, but because resolving these local disputes dry up troubled waters in which the Soviets could fish, and was a central part of our strategy of competition with the Soviet Union, and also was simply in our economic interest. As our economic ties to these areas grow, we have a strong economic interest in peace in these areas rather than conflict. The policy of this kind also has to look beyond the immediate demands on our diplomacy and look to some of trying to address some longer-term issues and our interest in seeing them resolved. This means a greater concentration than ever before on such things as human rights, nuclear non-proliferation, economic development, etc. Again, I would assert, and I'll come back to this, that these are American interests, not merely ideals. That we have an obvious interest in not preventing the spread of nuclear weapons. We have an interest in that. I don't think it's achievable, but at least it's slowing down the pace with which nuclear weapons may spread around the world. Even more with human rights. This is, I think, a fundamental American interest as well as a fundamental American value. Another element of a successful foreign policy, whether Carter policy, Reagan policy, or anybody else's policy in this complex world, is not only strong international economic policies, but a strong domestic American economy, which more than ever before, I think, is a foreign policy issue as well as a domestic issue. Without improvements in American productivity, without getting a grip on inflation, there simply will not be the economic base either for the kinds of military programs we need or for the kinds of other kinds of foreign policy resources that are required, which raises a ninth. I think so.
That's 7 and distinguish between strong international economic policy.
No, okay, 8 or 9. That's the issue of resources. This was an issue that became increasingly a matter of concern for Secretary Vance, and that probably became the most worrisome issue for Secretary Musk in these last months, and that is the foreign assistance programs, what kinds of resources we're going to put behind that diplomacy. The hard fact is that over the last 2 decades, the real levels of American foreign assistance have declined. We are now very low on the list of per capita donors of foreign assistance. And this assistance is not only the most immediate buttress for our diplomacy abroad. Nations generally are, of course, have a great stake in what kind of defense spending we're carrying out, but of most immediate relevance to them is what kind of security assistance, what kind of economic development assistance we're going to give to them. But it's also the way in which we address some of these longer-term trends, economic development, human rights. The problem is that it's going to become increasingly difficult in the coming years unless there's a real active political will to maintain those levels. The federal budget now, I think there's an impression given that when we talk about slashing the budget or whatever, that we're talking about the budget as a whole. The unhappy fact is that with the growth in fixed costs within the budget, Social Security payments, trust funds, etc., the federal budget now is taken up by already 3/4 of it for such fixed costs. This means that we are only playing now with about 25% of the budget for domestic social programs, for defense spending, and for foreign assistance. In a time of increasing concern about inflation, et cetera, and when the people who usually support foreign assistance on the Hill are also losing a lot of the domestic social programs to which they are committed, this shrinking part of the pie with which to play is more likely to squeeze out foreign assistance programs than the domestic social programs and the defense spending. And I think our nation will suffer if we allow that to happen. If you project the trends of recent years into the future, and if you take the Carter increases in defense spending, much less the Reagan increases, the amount of money with which we can use for defense programs, social programs, and foreign assistance will be cut in half by 1985. So if it's tough now, it's going to get a lot tougher by mid-decade. And our diplomacy, as I said, will suffer greatly if we don't preserve the resources that our diplomats need. Those are a lot of different elements that have to go into a foreign policy. They have conflicts among them, human rights versus security concerns, for example. Yet a failure to address any one of them, I think, means that the foreign policy as a whole is flawed. And so, as I said, the Carter administration tried to address all of them at once and said that it was doing so, and almost made a virtue of the complexity of the resulting policies and tried to portray it as a virtue. And it led to, I think, some real successes in various areas of the world that will have an enduring impact and that will serve the nation well in the coming years. Just a few of them. Quickly, the normalization of relations with China, which is not only a political and economic event of importance, but a strategic event as well. The improvement or the launching of the long-term defense program in NATO, and constant efforts to build up NATO's forces, and at the same time, programs to modernize all three parts of our strategic forces, and new efforts to beef up our conventional forces as well. The Panama Canal Treaty, diplomacy in Southern Africa, the Camp David Accord, certainly, and the achievement of a peace treaty between Egypt and Israel, which has not only prevented a war for the last 4 years between Israel and her neighbors, which is in itself, I think, an accomplishment given the tragic history of the area, but also has made the chances of a war in the coming years much less likely. The ending of the Turkish arms embargo, the integration of Greece into NATO. I could go on with human rights policy, which I think had a number of practical and important successes. The Zimbabwe settlement. But there were failures as well. The central failure, I think, was a failure to integrate the various strands of the policies that I had mentioned into a single and comprehensible whole. And here, while I think that Jimmy Carter was a good president, I really do, I think that failure has to be laid largely at his doorstep, not only because he is the person who portrays the policies publicly, is the spokesman, should be the spokesman for the government on foreign policy, but also because of the way he had structured the government. He quite, for the making of foreign policy, he quite consciously established a system in which there would be no single voice within the government that would present to him his view of the world and the policies that he would follow. He wanted, to his credit, he wanted to hear different points of view, he wanted to hear different policies, and he heard them. But the result was that no single person could speak absolutely authoritatively unless he were to put together the integrated overall policy that that person could put forward. And that he didn't do. And the result was not only the press and public were confused about the particular mix of all the different kinds of policies that I was describing, but the bureaucracy was often confused as well. This led in turn to what I think was the central substantive failing of the administration, which was the U.S.-Soviet relationship. And I'm sure we'll be coming back to that in the discussion. but there were different views of what that relationship ought to be, as you all know, within the government. They too often became public, and the president simply never put the different views together into a single coherent whole that could be used not only in explaining policies to the American public, but to make the Soviets understand very clearly what we were about. This is a dangerous failing, obviously, in the nuclear age. In looking into the future, I think there were two, flowing from the kind of analysis that I was laying out, I think there are two morals for it. One for the current administration and one for the defrocked, out of power liberals. For the Reagan administration, my concern is that it will be so, and is already, be so concentrating on the Soviet challenge that it will make policy mistakes by believing that if you deal with the Soviet challenge, that all of the other pieces will fall into place. I think that is simply not a realistic way of dealing with a very, very complex world. It does allow you to present a very popular, coherent view of American foreign policy right now, but I think it is a false coherence and one that does not accord with the complexities of the world and the dangers, will lead to dangerous mistakes. At the same time, I think that liberals have to address the same failings that that was so evident in the Carter administration, and that is to try to find ways to synthesize better these strands of the kinds of complex policies that liberals are drawn to. And there, let me suggest just a few of the kinds of syntheses that I have in mind. Somebody once said that liberals are people whose feet are firmly planted in midair. And I think when liberals fool with foreign policy, they have to be damn careful that they are making it clear that their feet are rooted in reality, as I think they are right now. This means, above all, in making clear how the pursuit of what are traditional American liberal goals in foreign policy, the pursuit of human rights, the concern for what happens to individuals abroad, the concern for economic development, is related to the hard business of standing up to the Soviet challenge and to meeting it effectively. Unless you do both, you are not going to have a complete American foreign policy. I think they're perfectly consistent. First, for liberals, the Soviet Union should be absolute anathema. For liberals, above all, Soviet domestic policies and Soviet foreign policies are the antithesis of what liberals believe both a domestic society and the world ought to look like. I was stunned sometimes when liberal friends of mine seemed less concerned about the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan than they were about American intervention in Vietnam, something I don't understand at all. There's nothing that liberals should be embarrassed about in wanting to compete with the Soviet Union and to deal with the Soviet challenge. At the same time, they have to demonstrate how that is synthesized, as I said, with pursuit of these liberal goals. Let me give you a few examples. Arms control and its relationship to military spending. The fact is that American military spending, in my view, ought to be increasing and increasing rapidly. The Carter administration defense budgets demonstrated that. The Reagan defense budgets go beyond it, but I don't think egregiously. That is not inconsistent with efforts at arms control. The fact is, whether you like it or not, that American military spending is going to increase. If it is done without arms control, however, without balanced arms control, agreements of the kind that we saw in SALT II, two things will happen. One, the levels of spending will be higher than they need to be because the Soviet threat will increase, unconstrained by arms control agreements. And secondly, and perhaps more important, although it received less attention, because there will be less knowledge on both sides about the military programs on both sides, because the SALT II agreement had limitations on interference with verification on both sides. We will simply know less about what the Soviets are going to be up to. And if we know less about what they're doing, we have less certainty in our own defense planning, and that planning then becomes more difficult, and we face potentially more dangerous situations. So in fact, arms control agreements are very much consistent with the kind of defense buildup that we need. And in fact, the SALT II agreement did not constrain any of the important defense programs that we had we were already pursuing. So my point is that arms control should not be seen as some sort of idealistic, visionary alternative to defense spending. It is simply a way of certainly building a safer and more stable relationship with the Soviet Union and having political advantages with the Allies, but most of all allows for more certain defense planning, and that is important. Second kind of synthesis that I think circles ought to be looking at is the, as I was saying, the relationship between our human rights policies and our security interests. In the short run, these do indeed sometimes come in conflict. When we have an important relationship, a security relationship with what has been called a mildly repressive, whatever that means, government abroad. When we go in and we hector them about human rights, try to encourage them in the direction of democratic reforms, yes, it becomes an irritant in our relations with them. And certainly we should never, in my judgment, let our human rights policies destabilize such governments if they are important to our security interests. It's, first of all, as a matter of principle, not up to us to be destabilizing anyone, whether it's on the right or the left. But the fact is that in the long run, our human rights policies tend to get at the very problems that create terrorism and create the instabilities with which we have to deal. People in these countries, whatever the United States thinks, are going to be insisting, and you can see it around the world, are going to be insisting on a better life, are going to be insisting in more participation in the affairs of their governments. And that can either take place through moderate, generally democratic institutions, which governments to which we are allied can build, or it's going to get bottled up, and then the only alternatives, both for those countries and for American policy, are going to be to support repression or to acquiesce in a radical victory when the revolutions take place. And once you get in that situation, as we did in Iran and as we are in El Salvador, the scope of flexibility for American foreign policy is very limited. It's much better early on to be encouraging our allies and others to create the moderate institutions that will allow change in moderate directions before they explode. And that is in our national security interest, as well as in accordance with American ideals. I think the human rights policy certainly should be pursued pragmatically and without a lot of moralistic and misleading rhetoric, which the administration sometimes was, for some parts of it, was addicted. And it ought to be more carefully rooted conceptually in American interests, American long-term interests. But it is. And to abandon the human rights policies and to make terrorism now the priority simply is to say, yes, terrorism is, in the long run, going to become increasingly a priority because we won't be dealing with its root causes. Finally, a third synthesis or false debate now taking place is between the so-called globalists and the so-called regionalists. The globalists who say that in every issue you look at the global conflict, the global competition between the Soviet Union and the United States, make your policy accordingly. And the regionalists, who tend to be liberals, saying that's wrong. You improve your relations, for example, with Africa by looking at regional realities, and don't worry about all this global stuff that leads you in the wrong direction. I think it's a terribly damaging debate, and one in which we've seen both the right and the left caricaturing each other. The fact is, because of the very intense nationalism of nations in the third world, they simply will not let the United States or the Soviet Union say you are a pawn in a global struggle. And when the United States or the Soviet Union, and the Soviet Union goes in and says, that is how I look at our relationship, you reduce your influence. And this leads to the paradox, therefore, that the best way to compete with the Soviets, as we certainly should be doing in these areas, is generally by carrying out the policies that make the most sense in third world terms. I think the best illustration of this is in Africa. where American influence, despite the Soviet gains in Ethiopia and Angola, American influence has been greatly increased over the last few years, and Soviet influence has decreased. We could go through this, but in Nigeria, and Guinea, and in Southern Africa, and Zimbabwe, and most of Africa, we have done very well in the competition with the Soviet Union. And we have done well, paradoxically, by not saying that we are doing it because of the competition in the Soviet Union. If you see what I mean? And thus the best regionalist policies are the best globalist policies, and vice versa. And I fear that we are going to undercut ourselves in our influence by insisting that other countries either be totally our friends or totally our enemies, and by carrying out exclusive policies rather than inclusive ones. Let me ask you a question on this, for example. I know all of us feel threatened when a third world nation that is friendly to us starts getting Soviet aid, or when the Soviets start establish an embassy there. We start to worry if our friend isn't starting to move away from the United States and towards the Soviets. And people who are generally the most anti-Soviet feel the most threatened about it. I don't understand why the mirror shouldn't be true, and why, therefore, we should not be actively establishing embassies and dealing with countries that are now oriented generally towards the Soviet Union and compete with them there. And why, instead, we should be saying, no, they are thus so tainted that we will, in effect, cede them to the Soviets in their spheres of influence. But this doesn't make sense. Well, those are I think, the kinds of syntheses that liberals ought to be moving towards, as I hope the Reagan administration, after the initial burst of rhetoric, in many ways models what was the start of burst of rhetoric 4 years ago, which implies that everything will be taken care of in specific new policies, when in fact, I think American foreign policies generally are about 95% the same administration to administration, because they reflect American interests. But I hope that the Reagan administration, as it gets over the initial phase, then moves, as the liberals move towards these syntheses, towards a broadened agenda of foreign policy concerns, and maybe, God willing, over time, Americans will stop, we disagree on the margin, will stop caricaturing each other's views, and we can begin to have American foreign policies that have, I think, a consensus is impossible and probably damaging if we need to debate, but at least a broader basis of understanding of what our general interests.
Well, Mr. Lincoln wanted this to be primarily a discussion.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
But I wasn't aware of it. All the light there introduction. Kind of a warm-up for new responsibilities at Amherst. Who's going to handle all questions? It usually means dominating the university. This is going to be
I would like to ask if you think the possible construction of a natural gas pipeline from Siberia to Western Europe will be in American interests, or will it tend to draw Western Europe away from the United States and into a dependency relationship to the Soviet Union? And what policies you would be recommending if you were advising the Reagan administration on
An unlikely prospect. It's a very interesting question, because there are two very clear competing goods here. One is anything that increases the flow of oil into the international market is importantly in our national interest now. I think we're about to, well, we are in a very difficult period, obviously, of oil price increases, but we're about to run out of the margin that we had about 2 million barrels a day surplus of last year, which allowed us to get through the Iran-Iraq, the consequences of the Iran-Iraq war. I think that's about to run out, and I think that the remainder of this year and next year are going to see a lot of pressures on oil prices as a result of that war, unless it can be resolved. And thus, we do have a very important interest in seeing anything that will get more oil into the international market, which will have a depressing effect on prices. And in that sense, getting more energy to Europe from any source is in our interest. On the other hand, clearly, it created a dependency of European nations on the Soviet Union. makes them liable to the kinds of implicit blackmails that we've seen on our own policies from multinations, et cetera. So as we've discussed this last year with the European governments, our main concern was to really drill them on whether they were creating such a dependency, whether they would become so hooked on Soviet oil that they couldn't kick the habit if they had to for political reasons. They're over 21. They're consenting adults. They said that they would not create such a dependency through such a pipeline, and therefore they thought it should go ahead. I'm not an expert on it. It was my impression from speaking to those who were that it would not create such a dependency.
Of the Carter administration. Could you deal with why you feel this is the case, and also perhaps bring up the concept of linkage and the arguments pro and con?
Well, as I said, I think it was a failure because it was confusing. I don't want to caricature either viewpoint, but well, I don't have to. I mean, you've all read what Brzezinski thought and what Vance thought. And I think there was a tendency, as they argued with each other, especially in the later years, to overstate their differences, which were not that large at the beginning on the issue. The president then never was able to put together the relative emphasis on cooperation and our mutual interest that Vance wanted, and the relative emphasis on competition that Stig wanted. And more importantly than that, I think that at the beginning, the administration was quite right in saying that the Soviet connection was not the only connection in our foreign policy. There had been an illusory belief by Kissinger, which I think is not right, that by cutting deals with the Soviets through a linkage strategy, but then by reaching overall general agreements, you can order most of the affairs of the world. I mean, slightly unfair to Kissinger, but I don't think that's possible because we saw in the agreements we did reach with the Soviets that there were very different conceptions of what each side had agreed to. I don't think that such agreements are possible with the Soviets. Our interests are too dissimilar. In any case, even if we could agree, even jointly, we don't have enough influence between us to order most of the affairs of the world. So I think Carter was quite right in the beginning saying, we're going to downplay this a little. I think Spig wanted to downplay it also, just as a way of getting at the Soviets a little, to make them come to us a little more and stop going after them quite so much. Unhappily, in the way it was presented not as the Soviets' challenge is still the central part of our foreign policy, but we have to do these other things as well. It sounded through the unfortunate Notre Dame speech as if we were saying the Soviet challenge doesn't matter so much anymore. And this was simply not in accordance with the facts of what the Soviets were doing, and it certainly wasn't in accordance with a growing American popular mood, so that for a few years anyway, exacerbated by some of the statements by people in the administration, it looked as if there was simply an indifference to the Soviet challenge, and then a spasmodic overreaction to the brigade in Cuba issue, and then to Afghanistan and the president's unfortunate statement about how he had now learned more about the Soviet Union than he had ever known before, which again fell into this perception of naivete and almost indifference previously. As I was suggesting, that needn't have been. It is perfectly consistent to want to compete like crazy with the Soviets in the Third World and to carry out the kinds of policies that we were carrying out in Zimbabwe, which was probably the greatest setback the Soviets have had in Africa in years. That synthesis should have been made. It wasn't. And the result was the Soviets never knew from week to week whether it was an American administration that wanted to cooperate across the board and sort of, in a way, go back to the overall deal-making of the Kissinger era, or whether it was going to be unrelenting competition, in short, whether it was all carrots or all sticks. And all carrots don't work, and all sticks don't work. Now, on linkage, I think linkage as a concept is terribly flawed for a number of reasons. And here I am referring to linkage as a negotiating strategy, something that the administration seems to be implying that it's going to pursue now, which is to say that you go to the Soviets and say, we're not going to agree in any single area unless we have agreement across the board on all areas. I think that's hopeless. First of all, as I was saying, I don't think you can reach those agreements in all areas. Secondly, I don't think the Soviets are ever going to say, we are moderating our behavior in this area so that you'll make an agreement here. And third, it loses a sense of proportion. The fact is that the SALT Treaty is deeply in America's national interest. We can debate that because I know there are certainly a lot of people in the Senate who didn't think that. I'm convinced that was so. I think 5 years from now, if we look at the situation without arms control and compare it to what could have been under SALT II, we will know it was in our interest. In any case, that is a far more profound issue and more in our interest than implicitly affecting Soviet behavior on the margin in an area like Ethiopia. Finally, I don't think the Soviets would ever agree to that any more than we would. If the Soviets came to us and said, we will reach agreement with you that is fair and balanced and in each of our interests, and it's not a loaded deal in either direction, if you will alter your behavior somewhere else, as a matter of principle, we would have to say no. Because once you've agreed to that, there's no end to it, and they can keep holding you up that way. And similarly, I think the Soviets would say, as a matter of principle, no, we're not going to negotiate on arms control if the cost of that is you're telling us what to do in other areas, because there'd be no end to it, and we could constantly drive them then with arms control. They simply could not afford to do it. It's a form of blackmail. And finally, objectively, it doesn't make any sense, because if this agreement is balanced, then you're getting an additional benefit in some other area, which is not a negotiating strategy that is pragmatic. The only thing you could do is to say, if you alter your behavior over in this area, we'll give you a slightly better deal on arms control. And that, I think, would be highly dangerous, because we should not enter into arms control agreements or agreements on strategic weaponry, which is so incredibly important, that are not to our advantage. So for all of those reasons, both the practicality and in theory, I don't think that negotiating linkage makes sense. Now, something we're trying to get across the Soviets, though, is that implicit linkage does exist as a fact of life. The fact is that when the Soviets fool around in Angola, or when they invade the sovereign third world nations in Afghanistan, that has an impact in the United States in public opinion. It has a political impact. It has to have an impact on the overall views of the Soviet Union among American policymakers. And thus, while we should not be sitting down with the Soviets and saying, you do this in SALT and we'll do that, you do this in SALT and you do that in El Salvador or wherever, just because that will fail and be rejected, we should be constantly making it clear to the Soviets that their behavior in these areas will have an impact on overall American policies. It will certainly have an impact on the ability of any administration to carry through on any cooperative agreements with the Soviet Union.
El Salvador. Clearly, the administration's point of view is this is a point of dispute. And yet, there's clearly also another point of view that Latin America is governed in too many instances by tyrannies and the rights of the people, and that many of these what we would call revolutionary groups are people seeking under nationalism a new expression of human rights and democracy, freedom which we would normally applaud. And I'd like you to comment on the danger, whatever you want, on the danger as I see it, that the administration policy of confronting Russia and El Salvador could in fact lead to driving the many states in Latin America into being communist aligned, because it's the only place they can get support. Therefore, it seems to me the ultimate result may be exactly the opposite of what they hope to achieve in El Salvador.
I think I'd amend the way you framed it while agreeing with the general thrust of what you're saying. I don't think a lot of these revolutionary groups are for democracy and for human rights and all those things. I think the left in El Salvador is probably every bit as repressive if they can only get their hands on power as the far right is in El Salvador. what we have been trying to do is to try to create middles. It's a very difficult thing to do. It's particularly difficult if you're trying to create democratic middles because you can't impose democracy on people. They have to want it. That's the bad news. The good news is in Latin America, more and more people seem to want democracy as in Africa. And I've been, if I could go off on just a slight tangent, because it was really interesting for the last few years. Just ask yourself for a moment how Americans would react if the following countries had drawn totalitarian and leftist. Portugal, Spain, Nigeria, Ghana, Peru, Ecuador, Dominican Republic, India kind of. There are more, but if all of those countries had gone in that direction, we would have a picture of the world that was in flames, in which America was a circle, and the world was a camp. And the fact is that every one of those countries has, in the last 6 or 7 years, gone democratic. And it's gone democratic not because the United States forced it into it, but because the people there wanted to. And I find that an exhilarating fact. I mean, the Nigerians adopting a constitution on our model, Ghana holding a military, wanting to hold elections, etc. So we really have something to work with in creating this middle. The fact is, in Latin American policies, to come back to your point, the fulcrum now of Latin American politics are among democratic nations, the Andean group, Venezuela especially, Peru, Mexico also. So there's a lot of democracy going on. And what we ought to be doing is to encourage the democracy, as I was saying, as a way of heading off the far left, as well as moving the far right. Now in El Salvador, in Nicaragua that too impossible, it was too far gone. In Guatemala, it's going to be very difficult if we try at all. In El Salvador, I think that this administration is right to be supporting the junta in El Salvador. I was for the Carter administration doing that. What concerns me about the drift of events, though, the direction of events, is that it's not enough simply to be supporting the junta against the left in El Salvador. And I have no sympathy. But at the same time, we have to be urging the junta to carry out the kinds of reforms that it was in fact carrying out last year, land reforms, trying to limit the really disgusting activities of the far right military is a part of the junta that doesn't yet dominate it. Because only that kind of a policy of both supporting Duarte and the junta and urging it to reform in the long run can succeed. If you simply support it, if you simply send it military assistance, and if you give it a carte blanche, I think what will happen within the junta is that there will be a hard right move. The junta will cease to become arguably reformist, which has undercut the political support to the left, clearly, and will become a purely rightist, repressive government. And then in the long run, what you're saying exactly will happen. You'll have a civil war between leftist extremists and rightist extremists, and we will lose either way it comes out. So it has to be both support and reform. And I see the support, and I sure hope we see the reform.
Yeah, so would you agree that this Vietnam analogy is wholly in El Salvador? The administration that you got the drawing, if you handle the Soviet Union problem, it all works out.
Go back up and just tell him he'll take care of that, right? Nobody will back.
In the short run, probably not. I think a lot of support for the junta will lead to real military gains by the junta. And my concern is that the administration will learn from that then, or think of things from that you do that everywhere and it will always work. In the long run, agreeing with you, I don't think it will work in El Salvador. In the long run, I think that the left will go underground, that a lot of the moderates now who are not supporting the left will move left in reaction, and that in the long run, El Salvador will cause a matter. Perhaps even more serious, then the same approach will be taken towards countries in Africa and in other areas where it won't work even in the short run.
What about the strong support Mexico is giving the leftists?
Frankly, I don't think it's strong support. I think that certainly the Mexican government does not believe that we should be supporting the junta, and a lot of European allies also believe we should not be supporting the junta. I frankly think that the Mexicans are taking that position. I would not say this in Mexico City. Not so much out of conviction, although they are doing it because they want to compete with the Cubans. I think it's in our interest if they do this, in fact. They want to compete with the Cubans for influence with the leftists, just as the Venezuelans did it in Nicaragua. But I think the Mexican government is doing it more for domestic reasons. They, in the nature of their internal policies, are irritating their own left. This is a way of making them smile on foreign policy issues because they're not going to go along with them on domestic issues. But it's a serious point because the fact is that if we do start supporting the junta without supporting the reforms, we're going to be absolutely crosswise with all of our natural friends in Central America and South America, and that also would be a significant loss.
Yes, I'd like to go back to this question of relations with Russia, and particularly this question of linkage. I gather that you say across-the-board linkage is really a hopeless and unworkable policy.
As a negotiating strategy.
As a negotiating tactic. However, implicit linkage is a perfectly acceptable and reasonable approach. Now, how would one apply that in terms, shall we say, of Afghanistan, where certainly there was quite explicit linkage, it seems to me, in terms of the American response? Let's now take the question of the uncertain situation in Poland. So, in terms of when you reject explicit but accept implicit linkage, how does one adjust, in your view, American policy in this fashion?
Well, you're quite right. There was, I should have said this, there was a direct linkage over Afghanistan. The question there becomes, what do you link it to? And what is in our interest? And what isn't in our interest? I mean, over Afghanistan, we're very direct in the sanctions that we carried out, and that was direct linkage. But we were also very clear that arms control measures were not included in the penalties over Afghanistan. And the reason for that was twofold. One, because, well, for the reasons I was saying, we have such a profound interest in arms control that if we had thrown that into the hopper, it would simply then, I think, across the board, Cold War, in a way, a loss of leverage then with the Soviets. And secondly, because of our European relationships. And if we had said no more arms control, then we would have been saying no SALT III, which would have thrown the TNF, the theater nuclear force deployment, which was in jeopardy to the Allies. So we did not link arms control. We did link to these other things. If there is which we thought was the most effective tactic, I think the Afghanistan sanctions actually had a considerable impact on Soviet thinking. Both because a number of those sanctions actually hurt, especially the grain embargo and psychological methods, but also because they really didn't think we'd do it. And to show them that we would indeed do it, I think was tremendously important where they're thinking about Poland. On Poland, it almost doesn't matter whether you're saying it's implicit or explicit. I think there is no question that if there were Soviet invasion of Poland, that is an end to arms control negotiations. It's an end to almost all economic intercourse with the Soviet Union. And probably more important in their calculations, I don't think they're going to be moved particularly by what the American response would be, since we already are pretty general. But I think it would be the end of the economy in Europe. I think you would see a reaction in Europe far stronger than the reaction of the Czechoslovakia and Hungary, because Poland is very different. More publicity about the Polish crisis. And I think that the prospect of an end to their economic, probably, at least in the short run, and political ties with Europe has to be a very, very significant factor in what has been already a higher degree of Soviet tolerance of events in Poland than I would have been today. And I frankly thought they would have been very much.
That's a more basic question. The only reckoning city papers and now is concerned, but recognizes competition. In your view, is there a definable limit of what Russia really wants?
It's an interesting question. Did you all hear that? The question is whether there is a definable limit to what Russia really wants.
Yeah, the world.
I saw in a piece, I think it was by Robert Kaiser in the Washington Post, where he used to mention this for 2 years. First, he was saying that the Soviets, as a doctrinal matter, assert as a goal world domination. They assert as a goal communism everywhere. But that as a practical matter, they don't have the slightest expectation that they are going to achieve that, and would be stunned if they thought anybody seriously thought that they could. But they're not about to let that go as a vision, just as our vision should be that every country will be, Senator Query in 1930 something or other said that with God's grace someday Shanghai will be just like Kansas City. I think we should have the same view, I think, and we don't expect it to happen. So what Soviet policy is more like, he said, is somebody running up and down, a thief running up and down a corridor in a hotel and trying every door constantly. And if a door will open, then you go in and you rip off the room. And I think that the Soviets are very much in the same position, that they will, most nations behave this way, where they see opportunities to advance their interests, where they seize opportunities to improve their power position, they will seize them. Now, happily, I think the Soviets aren't very good at this. They're tremendous at it in a military sense. In building up their military forces, they concentrate a lot on that, etc. But their diplomacy has, I think, been very, very poor in recent years. They're clumsy. They don't seize opportunities very well. And the result has been, just briefly, if you're a Soviet planner, or if you're a Soviet politician in foreign policy, like running for re-election, you've seen running around the world quickly. U.S. starting to rearm strongly. NATO allies starting to do more. Big problems in Eastern Europe, and probably don't have the economic resources to deal with it in the Soviet Union. So there's probably more problems coming in Eastern Europe still. China normalization, modernization within China, bad relations with Japan, this is if you're a Soviet. Totally messed up in Southern Africa, now pretty much excluded from the action in Zimbabwe. Poor relations with Nigeria, bad relations with Guinea, a lot of other countries we used to get along with well. Tied down in Afghanistan, taking greater losses than you thought, and your own army hasn't performed as well as you had hoped it would. Excluded from the Middle East peace process, in a quandary over what to do over the Iran-Iraq conflict, and oddly enough, your relations with both Iran and Iraq have deteriorated in recent years. Big energy problems, looking into the future. My point is not that they are not dangerous because of these problems. They're more dangerous because of these problems, in a way. But the fact is that while they have done very well in some areas, they have done very badly in others, and we need to more recognize that fact and also draw more lessons.
How do you think that we should try and because of what you have just described, try to strive more for understanding with the Soviet Union? More summit conferences, as was just suggested by their leader, and try to, instead of simply we'll load our guns, they'll load their guns. That isn't making peace, and that's not striving for understanding.
Well, understanding is a difficult thing. Sometimes you can understand people and it scares you. So I'm not sure. I don't mean to be flip about it, because I believe very much in that if we do not achieve a more stable relationship with the Soviet Union, then we may not be here, whatever the 10 years from now. But I don't think it can be achieved through understanding. I think that the efforts in the early 70s to achieve détente as a sort of a comprehensive understanding of the Soviet Union was inherently flawed and misleading, because then people in the United States believe that you can achieve this. I think what you need to do is, in a very unsentimental way, is to look for those areas in which we and the Soviets have mutual interests, and then try to build very specific agreements in those areas. The Soviets are very hard bargainers on them, but when they reach those agreements, they generally abide by them. They're very legalistic about those things. And as I've been arguing, the best place to start is arms control, because that's where really something was asked once, how come you rob banks? And said, that's where the money is. And in a way, in arms control, that's where the money is, because that's where the defense.
Isn't that really the end result, though? Isn't the first thing resources?
No, that's the point.
You need food, you need energy. That's what we should be talking about.
Well, I don't. In a better world, we could be talking to them about joint projects and energy development, the food deal that was good for us, as much as it was good for them, etc. But I think that unless you show them that there are penalties for the Afghanistans, you will never build or encourage them in the moderate directions that allow us to have a political basis for the kinds of cooperation that we're talking about. This is a point maybe I should have emphasized more before. There was something of an argument within the administration, and I think there was a broader national argument as to what the purposes of the Afghanistan sanctions were. With some people welcoming them simply because they were going to hurt the Soviets, and because they maybe implied just a return to undifferentiated hostility to the Soviets across the board and into it. The other point of view of those who are supporting the sanctions, and this is my own point of view, is that you have to have the sanctions as a device to try to moderate Soviet behavior, but that the purpose of that cannot be a return to the Cold War. It has to be very clearly put to the Soviets as part of a process in which we hope they will moderate their behavior, so that as both of us moderate behavior, we can come to the kinds of agreements that we're talking about. And I think that's the only way to proceed. I'm rather pessimistic now. I think that we are moving back towards undifferentiated hostility. And I don't think that we are looking as hard as we should be for those areas of mutual interest on which we can build. But that, I'm afraid, is a long process. It's going to be in the context of overall competition. And it's going to take a long time. But I don't see any short route through just an overall understanding. It's just not going to happen. It's certainly not going to happen in the current atmosphere.
To follow up the conversation here about U.S.-Soviet deal, I'm wondering, and you listed in your major trends, of course, the Soviet challenge, and the other three seem to be ones that tend more on what other nations, other than the U.S. and the Soviet Union, may or may not do in these two major superpowers. My question is this: are we really talking about what we or the Soviets might do, or are we really attempting to continue the level of slack, so to speak, that has been created in the world and seems to go up and down depending upon events in other parts of the world, in order to maintain some kind of influence, balance, off-guard attitude among these other nations in the world, who seem to be really the issues as we look at the next 20 years of this century?
I think it has to be all of the above, which is what I think you're saying. That, and I guess my basic point is that you have to not only deal with the Soviet challenge, and not only do the kinds of things that we're talking about, but you also have to address these other areas: economic development, human rights, relationships on their own merits in the third world. And the central danger before us is that there is now a national move in the United States which says that if you deal with the Soviets, you'll deal with all these other problems as well. And that simply is not the case. You have to wrestle with the complexity that comes when you're dealing with all of these things. And I would even, as I said, go further and say that if you deal, for example, in relations with Nigeria, in a U.S.-Soviet relationship, in a U.S.-Soviet context, you're not only going to hurt your relations with Nigeria, which matter to us greatly, it's our second greatest source of petroleum, but you're going to increase Soviet influence there. And thus the central paradox, that if you have only a U.S.-Soviet-oriented foreign policy, you're not going to have a very good U.S.-Soviet-oriented foreign policy. You got to do all these things.
There's a theory that the next 5 years, and they're dangerous because the Russian leaders died, the Russian military, and the Europeans.
because this is the time for
First of all, anybody who tells you that they can predict the future course of Soviet leadership, I would look on with the greatest suspicion. If you tried to sell your bridge, then you know exactly what the coming from starting.
Good source, good side.
Yeah, well, that's a possible theory, but nobody can know. And in fact, all of our experts have been consistently wrong. For example, we all thought 2 years ago that this Communist Party conference was going to have a lot to say about the future leadership of the Soviet Union, and that's already evident. If it's not having very much to say at all, and Brezhnev is still doing his limited thing. What will happen after Brezhnev goes, and my basic point is totally unpredictable. Nobody can know. It certainly is possible that the relative influence of the military will increase. Worse things are also possible, though. The Soviet military are certainly more aggressive, more zealous in a way than the foreign ministry, the Brezhnevs, some of the others in the leadership, but not necessarily as bad as some of the more ideological civilian leadership. So the military, an increase in military control would be a bad outcome, but not the worst outcome. My personal view is that it's unlikely. I think there is such a strong tradition of party control over the military in the Soviet Union that I think it's unlikely, in fact, that the military will assume control. At the same time, as the international situation worsens and as their perception of American hostility increase, I think